John Velarde, magnate of Solaris Investments in Mexico City, was laughing at a private dinner in front of friends and businessmen of the people served in the room. At that moment, a humble waiter approached, having seen an opportunity to humiliate the poor man serving his drink. He said loudly and for everyone to hear, "What's your name, little man?" "My name is Oliver Morales, sir," the waiter replied with a trembling voice. The millionaire, who had already planned a cruel joke in mind, said loudly, "I offer you my Aston Martin Vanquish in exchange for solving a simple riddle." The murmur in the room was alive with anticipation. John, who thought he was humiliating him, didn't know the secret Oliver was hiding that could make him stagger. John Velarde walked with a sure step through the polished marble of his penthouse in the Torre Reforma. Dawn was just beginning to illuminate the city, but inside that space, everything seemed like a parallel universe. The floor-to-ceiling windows let in a golden light that reflected off Italian bronze sculptures and original paintings by Tamayo and Rivera. The air smelled of freshly ground Colombian coffee served on Versace china. At 47 years old, John had become synonymous with power and arrogance. His name appeared on the covers of financial magazines. His fortune was counted in the billions. And his ego grew at the same pace as his skyscrapers. That dawn was no different. The tycoon woke up wrapped in a black silk robe with gold embroidery by Louis Vuitton, adjusted his white gold Rolex to Turner watch, and lit a Cohiba cigar brought from Havana by a diplomat. He walked with his cell phone glued to his ear, giving orders to his assistant to close a multi-million-dollar deal in Madrid. His tone was cold, calculating, almost military. He wouldn't take no for an answer. Whoever listened to him learned to fear him. John was born rich. His father, Hernan Velarde, had founded Invagine Solaris in the 1970s, building his empire with oil, real estate, and political connections. John grew up surrounded by chauffeurs, governors, first-class travel, and parties at villas in Marbella. He never knew scarcity, and from a young age, he learned to look down on those he considered the same old people, those who worked to serve him. His mother told him repeatedly that he was a modern prince, and he believed her. He graduated from Harvard, had his photo taken with presidents, rubbed shoulders with Arab sheiks, and grew accustomed to the world bowing to his last name. However, that morning, as he sipped a glass of Chateau Margaux opened only to wet his lips before breakfast, his eyes wandered into an uncomfortable memory. A memory he loathed. The time an elementary school teacher corrected him in front of everyone because he didn't know how to tie his shoelaces. That day, a humble boy, Oliver Morales, approached him and tied them without saying a word. What a humiliation. From then on, John had sworn that no one, absolutely no one, would ever embarrass him again. Outside, the city roared with its contrasts. Traffic devoured avenues, horns blared like an out-of-tune orchestra, and street vendors mingled with businessmen in suits on the sidewalks. Miles away, in a forgotten neighborhood of Itzaptala, Oliver Morales woke up in a 10-square-meter room he shared with his 12-year-old daughter, Lucia. The mattress was worn, the walls stained with moisture, and a poorly closed window let in the sound of trucks. Oliver got up slowly, his bones heavy from accumulated fatigue. He had worked until dawn cleaning tables in an event hall, and still had to report to a luxury hotel where he was hired as a temporary waiter. His clothes were clean, though old, a white shirt with frayed edges, black pants that had lost their shape, and hand-polished shoes that showed scars from years of use. His daughter looked at him with large, dark eyes, filled with a dignity he barely understood. "Dad, aren't you going to have breakfast?" she asked, holding up a plate of stale bread she had heated in a pan. Oliver smiled tiredly. "You eat, Lucia. I'll fix myself up back at work." Lucia was his biggest reason to keep breathing. He had lost everything else. His carpentry business had gone to ruin because of a partner who betrayed him. His wife had left him years before. And the only thing left standing was that clear-eyed girl who looked at him as if he were the strongest man in the world. Deep down, Oliver knew he wasn't, but he tried to pretend he was. While John climbed into his shiny red Ferrari 812 Superfast to head to a meeting with the Secretary of the Economy, Oliver clung to a crowded minibus, breathing in the smell of gasoline, sweat, and fried foods. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. John traveled with classical music playing on a Van Olufsen system. Oliver clung to a metal bar, while cheap reggaeton vibrated through broken speakers. The millionaire had breakfast on the terrace of the St. Regis Hotel, freshly baked croissants, smoked salmon, and coffee served by a barista dressed in an impeccable suit. Oliver, on the other hand, drank a glass of water in a corner of the hotel where he worked. Waiting to be called to load trays, each sip was a caress to deceive his hunger. Their lips moved in parallel without touching, like rails that seemed destined never to cross. And yet, fate was already aligning the pieces. John was preparing for a private dinner with businessmen and politicians at the same hotel where Oliver worked. A dinner where luxury would overflow like a river of excess, and where the arrogance of the millionaire would clash head-on with the silent dignity of the humble man. Preparations began early. In the hotel's main hall, Persian rugs were unrolled, tables dressed with Egyptian linen tablecloths, and Murano glass glasses sparkled under Swarovski chandeliers. The scent of white truffles and roast lamb filled the air. John had arranged every detail, nothing was to go wrong. Meanwhile, Oliver carefully ironed the tablecloths, made sure the chairs were aligned, and took orders from a supervisor who barely looked him in the eye. His back ached, but he didn't complain. He had learned long ago that dignity didn't depend on circumstances, but on how one faced them. That night, their stories would begin to intertwine. Too great arrogance was about to meet too firm humility. John didn't know it yet, but his life was about to be pierced by the serene voice of Oliver Morales, a voice that, like an invisible dagger, would end up wounding where neither money nor power could protect him. The clock struck 8 at night. The guests arrived in Maceratas, Bentleys, and black limousines with tinted windows. The women wore haute couture gowns by Gucci and Dior, diamond necklaces, and heels that sparkled under the camera flashes. The men wore custom-made Armani suits and Patek Philippe watches that cost as much as a city apartment. The music of a string quartet filled the air. John appeared last, as always, leaving everyone waiting for him. He got out of his silver Aston Martin Vanquish, surrounded by black-clad bodyguards. His mere presence stopped the murmur. He walked with the measured stride of someone who knows he owns the place. He greeted them coldly, smiled just enough, and took his seat at the main table, next to a minister and the owner of Corporación Hernandez Global. Oliver, meanwhile, was pouring glasses of Chateau Lafite Rothschild wine with steady hands, though they trembled inside. He couldn't help but overhear the comments, the laughter, the phrases spoken in a world that didn't belong to him. He moved with the agility of someone who has learned not to be seen, but his eyes absorbed every detail, as if life itself were asking him to be attentive. Destiny was about to speak. John, with a haughty smile, looked at the humble waiter who was approaching to remove a plate. It was then that, in a mocking tone and in a voice that everyone heard, he uttered the phrase that would set the night ablaze. "Let's see. Kid, if you're as clever as you seem, I'll give you my Aston Martin Vanquish. What do you say?" The room erupted in laughter. Glasses clinked, and everyone's eyes were fixed on Oliver. The trap was set. The tycoon believed he was humiliating him. No one imagined that what was about to come out of Oliver Morales' mouth would change the course of their lives forever. The silence that followed the laughter was almost unbearable. The echo of John's words still hung in the air, like a poison that refuses to dissipate. Oliver, holding the tray, felt everyone's gazes piercing his skin like needles. Their faces watched him with a mixture of mockery and expectation, as if they expected him to fall to his knees in gratitude for the magnate's grotesque gesture. John raised his wine glass, shook it with the arrogance of an emperor playing with his subject, and repeated with a hint of irony, "Come on, boy. What are you saying? An Aston Martin Vanquish? You don't receive such an offer every day." The laughter renewed, louder, crueler. Some guests tapped their gold rings on the table, as if marking a rhythm of humiliation. The minister smiled with satisfaction, and a woman covered in diamonds commented in a low voice, "I'm sure you can't even pronounce Aston Martin." Oliver swallowed. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't let go of the tray. Inside, a voice screamed at him to be silent, to avoid any words that might make things worse. Yet another voice, older, deeper, reminded him that he shouldn't let himself be crushed. Not again, not after everything he'd lost. "Sir," he said calmly, barely raising his gaze to John, A car like that won't fit on the street where I live. I couldn't even park it without it being towed away in 5 minutes. The room fell silent. John's smile froze on his face. The laughter died away as if someone had slammed a door. No one expected that response. It was simple, humble, but laced with a truth so pure it was uncomfortable. The tycoon frowned, took a sip of wine, and continued, "So tell me, what do you want? Money? A blank check? Do you want me to pay for your daughter's college? Because I imagine you have children, don't you?" Oliver took a deep breath, his dark eyes shone in the light from the chandeliers. "Yes, sir, I have a daughter, and of course I'd like to pay for her college, but not with your money. I prefer it to be with my own effort." The sentence fell like a stone in water. Invisible ripples shook the entire table. Some guests looked at each other uncomfortably, others tried to laugh nervously, but the tension was evident. John placed his glass on the table with a sharp thud. Inside his mind, something was burning. How dare this man answer him like that? How dare he reject what for anyone would be a miracle? In your world, no one would refuse a gift from your hand, but there stood Oliver, firm, his worn shoes and old shirt, speaking with a dignity that not even all his Rolex watches could buy. "Don't be ridiculous," John snapped, his face flushed with suppressed anger. "Do you know how many would kill for that opportunity? You're a nobody." Oliver lowered the tray and placed it on a side table. Then, without raising his voice, he replied, "Perhaps, sir, perhaps I'm a nobody to you, but my daughter doesn't think so, and believe me, that's enough for me." There was a thick silence, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. A low murmur began to spread through the guests. Like an uncomfortable wind that couldn't find an outlet, the minister coughed to hide it. The woman in diamonds took a sip of champagne, but no one knew what to do. John tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. "How funny," he said, trying to regain control. "We have here a philosopher disguised as a waiter." However, his laughter was lost in the general discomfort. The guests were no longer laughing with him. Some looked at Oliver with a kind of silent respect. Others averted their gaze, as if they felt complicit in a humiliation that had failed. Oliver bowed slightly in a sign of respect, picked up the tray, and walked away without another word. His gait was calm, serene, as if he had said exactly what he should have said. But inside John, something was breaking. That man, that simple waiter, had disarmed his arrogance with short sentences and without raising his voice. Unacceptable. When Oliver left the dining room for the kitchen, the murmurs turned into whispers. "That guy has character," a businessman commented in a low voice. "More dignity than many of us," whispered another. Looking at John out of the corner of his eye, the tycoon heard everything. Although he feigned indifference, every word was like a thorn digging into his flesh. His mind was swarming. How dare he? Who the hell does he think he is? In the kitchen, Oliver placed his hands on a stainless steel table and closed his eyes. His heart was pounding, his legs were shaking. He knew he'd risked too much, but he also knew that if he had kept quiet, he would have lost more than his dignity that night. A co-worker, a young man named Ricardo, who had been a waiter for just 2 weeks, looked at him in astonishment. "Hey, are you crazy? Do you know who you spoke to like that? That guy could make you disappear from every hotel in the city." Oliver opened his eyes and sighed. "I know, kid, but I also know I can't live on my knees forever." That night, the tension didn't completely dissipate. John tried to continue the evening, talking about investments in Barcelona, his new property in Miami, a recently acquired yacht in Monaco, but his words no longer carried the same weight. The image of the waiter haunted him like an uncomfortable shadow. When the guests had left and the lights in the lounge went out, John went up to his presidential suite at the hotel. He lit another cohiba, poured himself a 30-year-old Macallan whiskey, and sat by the window, gazing at the illuminated city. The smoke formed dense spirals in the air. "A waiter," she muttered with suppressed rage. "A damn waiter dared to speak to me like that." She slammed her glass on the table, spilling a few drops of whiskey onto the Persian rug. She remained motionless for a few seconds, gritting her teeth. Then, unwillingly, she remembered Oliver's words, "I prefer it to be with my own effort." She stood up abruptly, pacing the suite like a caged beast. She couldn't let it stay that way. The next day, she would find a way to crush that man, to make him regret it. She didn't know how, but she would. Meanwhile, in his small room in Itzaptala, Oliver arrived exhausted. Lucia was already asleep, cuddling a notebook full of colorful drawings. Oliver covered her with a blanket and looked at her tenderly. Her face reflected everything she had lost and everything she still had left. He sat silently, his back against the damp wall, and thought about what had happened. He knew John Velarde wouldn't easily forget that scene, but he also knew that, for the first time in a long time, he had defended the only thing that still belonged to him, his dignity. And even though the whole world looked at him as a nobody, that night he allowed himself to smile, because without intending to, he had achieved the impossible. He had shaken the most arrogant man in the city. What Oliver didn't know was that the spark that had ignited in the hotel lounge wouldn't go out. Quite the contrary, it was about to become a fire that would destroy everything around it. If you are enjoying this story, I'd sincerely appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. If you could give me a like, it would brighten my day, and if you comment, I'll learn how to improve as a writer. Thank you for your support, and I appreciate you being here. Let's continue. John woke up with a strange malaise. It wasn't physical. Although he had drunk too much Macallan whiskey the night before, it was something deeper. A discomfort he couldn't get out of his chest. He had slept in the presidential suite at the St. Regis, surrounded by goose-down pillows, Egyptian cotton sheets, and a picture window that offered a privileged view of Paseo de la Reforma. However, all he could see, even with his eyes closed, was the face of that waiter who dared to challenge him in front of everyone. He lit a Cohiba cigar, took a drag, and exhaled in annoyance. A damn nobody. How can he torment me like this? He thought. He was used to humiliation being one way, from top to bottom, never the other way around. And yet, Oliver Morales had achieved something that not even the most powerful men in politics or finance could. He had sewn a crack in his security. At noon, John attended a meeting at the main offices of Invagine Solaris. In the Tormea, the conference room was covered in black marble, with a long mahogany table and Italian leather armchairs. A vintage Patek Philippe watch hung on the wall. The executives were discussing new acquisitions in Bogota and a real estate project in Barcelona. But John barely listened. His mind returned again and again to the same scene. Oliver's words, his calmness, his refusal to bow down. One of his partners, Ernesto Herrera, noticed his distraction. John, is something wrong? You're acting strange today. John glared at him, as if he'd caught him naked in the street. Take care of the numbers, Ernesto. The rest is none of your business. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere remained tense. No one dared to insist when John wore that expression. Meanwhile, in Itzaptala, Oliver was returning from a grueling shift. The sun beat down relentlessly on the dusty streets. He passed by a market, where the smell of tacos al pastor mingled with the aroma of fresh fruit and cheap fried foods. He bought a couple of pieces of bread and a liter of milk. Enough for dinner with Lucia. He walked with a firm step, although fatigue weighed on him like chains. On the way, a neighbor stopped him. Oliver, did you hear? They saw you at that luxurious event, waiting tables. They say one of the bigwigs made you a strange offer. Oliver smiled sideways. That's right, but you know how those people are. To them, you're worthless. The neighbor looked at him curiously. They say you answered something that left him speechless. I only told the truth, Oliver replied, without giving any further details. He didn't want to make a spectacle of it. That night, in her room, Lucia looked at him while they were doing homework together. Dad, is it true that a rich man wanted to give you his car? Oliver was silent for a few seconds. Yes, dear, but it wasn't a real gift. It was meant to be a joke. And what did you say? She asked, her eyes shining. Oliver stroked her hair. I told him no, that I prefer our relationship to be hard-earned. Lucia smiled proudly. You always tell me that what matters is what we earn through hard work. Right, that's right, princess, and never let anyone tell you otherwise. In that moment, Oliver felt that even though he lacked luxuries, he possessed something no millionaire could buy: his daughter's unadulterated admiration. On the other side of town, John was trying to distract himself with a party at his Las Lomas mansion. The place looked like a modern palace, a pool lit with blue lights, a white marble bar stocked with Dom Perignon champagne, electronic music playing through Bose speakers, and women in Versace dresses laughing their heads off. His friends surrounded him, talking about investments, Udmer's piglet watches, and trips on private jets. But John didn't feel part of that euphoria. He drank in silence, isolated, staring at the pool as if he might find an answer there suddenly. Someone casually commented, "Hey, John, we heard what happened at the St. Regis. Is it true a waiter left you quiet?" Laughter erupted around him. John clenched his fists. "Who told you that? He's running around. You know how the networks are." Another guest responded, amused. John smiled coldly, even though he was burning inside. "A poor devil doesn't keep me awake at night. Forget it." But he knew it was a lie. It did keep him awake at night. And what's more, I was chasing him. He decided then that he had to investigate that man. It wasn't possible for someone insignificant to dismantle him like that and go unpunished. The next day, he ordered one of his assistants to gather all the information possible on Oliver Morales. Full name, address, family, work history, everything. When the report reached him, John read it carefully. He discovered that Oliver had owned a carpentry shop, that it had gone bankrupt because of a partner, that his wife had abandoned him, and that he now lived alone with his daughter in humble conditions. John smiled maliciously. "Perfect," he murmured. "Every man has a weak spot." That afternoon, Oliver received an unexpected visitor at the hotel where he worked. It was a man in a grey suit, one of John's assistants. He approached him in a condescending tone. "Mr. Velarde wants to talk to you. He'll expect you tomorrow in his office in the Tourmaire." Oliver looked at him suspiciously. "And why would he want to talk to me?" "You'll find out when you go," the man replied, handing him a card. That night, Oliver couldn't sleep. He felt like he was entering dangerous territory. What did John want from him? Why wouldn't he leave him alone? But when he looked at his daughter sleeping, he decided he had to face whatever came. He couldn't run away. The next day, he entered the Tourmaire. He had never been in a place like this. The floors shone like mirrors. The elevators ascended with an elegant weir. The guards looked him up and down. He arrived at John's office, an immense space, with glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the entire city. The desk was made of black marble, and behind it hung abstract paintings worth millions. John greeted him with a cold smile. "So you, Oliver Morales, the man who thinks he can teach me lessons in dignity." Oliver stood firm. "I didn't come to lecture you, so I just responded with what I felt." John stared at him. "You know what? I'm offering you a deal. Work for me. I want to see if that dignity of yours is of any use in the real world." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Work for you exactly. I'll pay you 10 times what you earn now. But you will be at my disposal. I want to see how long your humility lasts when you're surrounded by power and money." Oliver was silent for a few seconds. He knew this was a trap. John didn't want to give him a chance. He wanted to destroy him from within. But at the same time, he thought of Lucia. Perhaps it was the only way to ensure his future. Finally, he replied, "If what you want is to test me, I accept." John smiled with a cruel glint in his eyes. "Perfect. Let's see how long your dignity lasts." At that moment, a dangerous game began. John, the millionaire who had never been questioned, had brought a humble man into his field, intending to crush him. But what he didn't imagine was that little by little, this decision would lead him to face his own internal ruin. The following days marked the beginning of a silent duel. Oliver now entered the offices of Invigene Solaris dressed in a cheap suit they had provided him, an outfit that starkly contrasted with the Armani, Hugo Boss, and Ermenegildo Zegna suits worn by the executives there. From the first moment, he felt the contemptuous stares. To them, I was an intruder, an experiment by the boss, almost a joke in bad taste. John, sitting behind his black marble desk, watched him like a scientist examining a laboratory rat. "I want you to start with the most basic things," he said in a dry tone. "Get these files in order, review old contracts, and write a report. I want to see if your dignity also serves to read papers." Oliver nodded calmly, unbothered. He spent hours sorting through boxes of documents, yellowed folders redolent of years of accumulated time. Contracts with names of cities he'd only heard about on the news. Madrid, Bogota, New York, Shanghai. All of that seemed to belong to another universe. And yet, he worked patiently, reading every line, as if each word hid something he needed to learn. John watched him from his inner office, waiting for him to complain, to make a mistake, to collapse, but the man remained there, calm, meticulous, without losing his composure. What the hell sustains him? The tycoon wondered, growing increasingly irritated. Nights found him alone in his Los Lomas mansion, surrounded by works of art and bronze sculptures, with a grand piano that no one played and a cellar of French wines he rarely touched. He opened a bottle of Chateau d'Yquem worth thousands of dollars. But the taste seemed bland. He walked barefoot on Persian rugs, lit a cohiba, and sank into the leather chair. His mind dragged him, mercilessly, toward memories he'd sworn to bury. He remembered his father, Hernan Velarde, sitting in a dark office, surrounded by tobacco smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. "John, don't be weak," he repeated. "The poor are made to serve. Never trust them. If one ever looks you in the eye, make sure they bow their head." That voice haunted him like an echo. He had built his life obeying it, becoming the man who crushed everyone. But now, a simple waiter had held his gaze and wouldn't lower it. What if my father was wrong? No, I can't think that. He would get up in the middle of the night, walk through the halls of his mansion lit by automatic lights, and pour himself more whiskey, as if he could find answers at the bottom of the bottle. But all he found were more ghosts. In the office, meanwhile, Oliver continued with his tasks. His colleagues treated him with disdain, throwing sarcastic comments. "What's this guy doing here?" they murmured. "It's probably just the boss's whim, he'll get bored of him." But Oliver didn't respond. He had learned to endure much worse humiliations. He just did his job, listened, and observed, little by little. He began to notice errors in the contracts, irregularities in the balance sheets. He realized that some of John's associates were cheating him with doctored figures, diverting funds to hidden accounts. One afternoon, in a calm voice, he mentioned it to the tycoon. "Sir, excuse me, but I think there's something strange here. These numbers don't add up." John looked at him incredulously. "You, a bankrupt carpenter and hotel waiter, comes to tell me that my balance sheets don't add up?" Oliver held his gaze. "I'm not an accountant, sir, but I know when something doesn't add up." The tycoon reviewed the documents and, to his surprise, found he was right. An awkward silence fell over him. It was impossible to deny the obvious. That night, instead of feeling satisfied, John felt fear. How is it possible? How could he see what my own managers couldn't? What kind of man is this? The following days were an emotional whirlwind. John tried to appear cool, but inside he was falling apart. Memories of his childhood haunted him. He saw his mother, elegant and distant, drinking champagne at endless parties while he hid under the table because his parents argued loudly. He remembered how Hernan called him a weak boy every time he cried. He remembered the day when he was barely 8 years old. A driver told him he had never seen such a sad child surrounded by so many expensive toys. In the present, those memories mingled with the figure of Oliver, that poor man who, despite everything, remained composed, with his back straight, with a peace that John had never felt. One morning, unable to sleep, he walked to his trophy room, collectible Swiss watches, photographs of presidents, the King of Spain, and Hollywood stars. He looked at them one by one. Suddenly, they seemed empty, cold, insignificant. He hit the display case in rage, and one of the watches fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. "Damn it!" he shouted, his eyes reddening. He sank to the floor, breathing heavily. "What's happening to me? Why does that man affect me so much? I am John Velarde. I control everything." But an inner voice, weak but persistent, whispered to him, "You don't control everything. You never have." The next day, at the office, he watched Oliver working silently, reviewing papers, taking notes in an old notebook he had brought from home. For a moment, John felt something he had never felt toward a poor man: envy. Envy of that calm, that silent strength that didn't need Armani suits or gold watches to sustain it. He tried to quell that feeling with more arrogance. He gave him absurd tasks, made him stay late, sent him to meetings where he knew he would be looked down on. But Oliver didn't complain. He endured it all, with that dignity that was like a mirror in which John was beginning to see his own misery. One afternoon, as he was leaving the office, he saw Oliver at the bus stop, patiently waiting for the minibus that would take him to Itzaptala. John drove past him in his Ferrari 812 Superfast, deliberately accelerating so that the roar of the engine would envelop him. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Oliver was smiling, talking on the phone with his daughter. That smile, simple and genuine, was worth more than his entire car. John slammed the steering wheel angrily. No, it can't be. I can't let this man disarm me like this. That night, in his mansion, he opened another bottle of expensive wine. But the taste was bitter. He walked through its marble hallways, its rooms filled with works of art, and suddenly everything seemed empty, hollow, like a stage without actors. He looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in many years, he didn't see the powerful magnet, the invincible man. He saw a frightened boy, with tired eyes, a fractured soul, and in that instant, he understood he was falling. It wasn't Oliver who was destroying him, it was himself. Dawn came laden with a strange silence. John, who never got up early because he usually went to bed at dawn after dinners with politicians or businessmen, found himself awake before dawn. He walked to the large windows of his master bedroom, from where the entire city could be seen stretching out like a monster of lights. He gazed at it with a feeling of emptiness. Millions of souls were breathing down there. Millions of struggles, millions of stories, and yet he felt like the loneliest man on earth. Inside him, an idea was brewing. Something is about to break. The day at the company began like any other, with secretaries coming and going, phones ringing, and the FOSO's voice presenting figures in a boardroom that resembled a temple of marble and steel. John listened half-heartedly, frowning, while Oliver, sitting in a corner with a notebook, took humble notes. Suddenly, a detail struck him. Oliver cautiously raised his hand. "Excuse me, sir, but those projections the FOSO mentions, they don't match the contracts I reviewed last week. There's a difference of almost $3 million. A deathly silence filled the room. The executives exchanged uncomfortably. The FOSO, a man in a suit with a stilted voice, tried to laugh it off. This kid is confused. He's not trained to understand balance sheets. But John glared at him. Silence. His voice cracked like a whip. He stood up, took the papers Oliver was pointing at, and began to review them. With each line he read, the ice spread in his blood. Oliver was right. $3 million had disappeared. John's eyes darkened. "Explain this to me, Ramirez," he demanded of the financial director. The man stammered, searching for words, but none came out firmly. John understood immediately he was being robbed. The blow was twofold: the betrayal of his own circle, and the revelation that the man he had tried to humiliate was the one who had opened his eyes. That afternoon, he expelled the financial director amid shouts and threats of jail. But when the office fell silent, instead of feeling powerful, he felt a tremor in his chest. He sat down in his leather chair and covered his face with his hands. "What's happening to me?" he whispered. The answer was not long in coming, with an echo that seemed to spring from the walls. "You are alone, John. You always have been." Meanwhile, Oliver returned home by minibus, as calm as ever. His daughter ran to hug him as soon as he opened the door, and her laughter filled the small apartment with a warmth that contrasted with the tycoon's frigid mansion. Oliver told her, laughing, that he had discovered something important at work. His daughter listened with shining eyes, as if her father were a hero. That night, while Oliver dined on beans and tortillas, John dined on lobster on an Italian porcelain plate. Completely alone, the contrast haunted him, like a poison. The following days were a slow descent. John began to notice things he'd previously ignored: the coldness with which his partners greeted him, the fake smiles at cocktail parties, the glances that averted their gazes when he entered. He discovered more embezzlement, more deception. His empire, which he had believed solid as steel, was riddled with cracks. Every time he found a fraud, Oliver was there, silent, pointing out with precision. It was as if that humble man possessed a clarity that had eluded him all his life. One night, John collapsed in his trophy room, surrounded by empty bottles. The echo of his father's voice tormented him. "The poor are your enemies, son. Don't trust them." Arthur pounded his fist on the ground. "I hate you, you damned old man," he shouted, tears in his eyes. For the first time in decades, he cried. He cried like a child who had never been comforted. He cried like a man who realized his entire life had been a sandcastle. In that crying, however, something began to break, and also to open. Dawn found him lying on the floor, his eyes swollen and his chest empty. But in that emptiness, a question he'd never allowed himself to ask was born. What if he, that poor man, has what I've always been looking for? The next day, John arrived at the office early. Without his usual arrogance, he saw Oliver walking in with his worn suit and old briefcase. For a moment, the tycoon felt the urge to ask him for something he'd never asked anyone before: help, but he restrained himself. His pride was still strong. Though no longer indestructible, the internal struggle was just beginning. That day, the air in the Solaris Investments tower seemed different. John, accustomed to entering with a firm stride and steely gaze, now walked with a weight on his shoulders that not even he could hide. The employees, surprised, watched him pass by without his usual arrogance. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand bows, or even responded to the greeting with his usual haughty gesture. Something in him had changed, although he still didn't know how far that growing rift would take him. In the boardroom, the executives settled nervously. The rumor of the FOSO's dismissal had spread like wildfire, and many knew their own secrets could be exposed. John sat at the head of the table, but instead of launching into a high-flown speech, he remained silent. He looked at each one, scrutinizing them carefully, as if searching for something in their faces, and then, against all odds, he spoke in a calm voice. "Today we won't talk about numbers," he said. "Today I want us to talk about what this group really means. What are we? A money machine? A power game? Or do we have something else to offer?" Faces tightened, gazes shifted. No one understood what was happening to the tycoon. Some thought it was a trick to scare them, but Oliver, sitting at the end of the table, looked at him calmly, and that calm was like a mirror in which John saw himself reflected. That same afternoon, John made an unprecedented decision. He cancelled a trip to Dubai for a meeting with investors, and instead asked Oliver to accompany him on a tour of the production plant on the outskirts of the city. The employees could hardly believe their eyes when they saw their boss, always unparable, walking through the aisles, observing the machines, awkwardly greeting the workers. One of them, a man with rough hands and a tired look, recognized him immediately. "You've never set foot in here, Don John." The tycoon swallowed. "I've never felt so embarrassed." "You're right," he admitted, "and that was a mistake." The worker looked at him in surprise. He wasn't used to hearing those words from the most powerful man in the company. That night, John didn't return to his mansion directly. He asked Oliver to take him on the subway to his neighborhood. He got off at a crowded station, surrounded by street vendors, improvised musicians, children running around with cheap backpacks. The smell of fried foods, the metallic noise of the trains, the mingling voices, everything hit him with an unknown force. "How do you endure this chaos every day?" John asked, unable to hide his bewilderment. Oliver smiled. "You get used to it, boss, but also, you learn to see the beauty amidst the noise. Look at those children running around. Look at that woman selling aropas to feed her family. There are no luxuries here, but there is life, and life, sir, weighs more than all the gold in the world." The words cut through him like knives. John thought of his echoing mansion, his parties filled with flattering strangers, his cars gleaming in a garage where no one used them. What good was all of that if there was no real life? Upon arriving at Oliver's small apartment, he was greeted by the warm aroma of freshly cooked beans. Oliver's daughter ran to hug him, without fear, without protocol. John, bewildered, didn't know how to react. Never had a child hugged him so naturally. He remained motionless, as if the gesture were an unknown language. "Come in, sir." Even for a moment, Oliver said humbly. The tycoon entered. He saw the walls with peeling paint, the worn wooden table, the frayed curtains, but he also saw something that was never in his mansion: family photographs, laughter, a human warmth that struck him like a revelation. He sat in an uncomfortable chair and for the first time in years ate a simple dish, served with love. That night he couldn't sleep. In his room with silk sheets, he remembered the little girl's hug, the smell of homemade food, Oliver's words. He got up, walked through the mansion, and realized it was full of emptiness, emptiness covered in marble, crystal, and gold, but empty nonetheless. At dawn, he made the riskiest decision of his life. He would sell one of his yachts, the most expensive, the pride of his parties in the Mediterranean. And with that money, he would fund a scholarship program for the children of his company's workers. When he announced it at the meeting, the executives were outraged. "He's crazy," one of them shouted. "That's throwing money away." John stood up, looking at them with a newfound calm. "Throwing money away is spending it on watches you never wear. Throwing money away is paying for parties where everyone silently hates me. This isn't throwing money away, this is giving it back." Many resigned that day, unable to follow a man who no longer responded to the logic of power. John let them go. For the first time, he didn't mind losing false allies. As the months passed, the company changed. Scholarships, health programs, support for needy families. John himself began visiting poor neighborhoods, always accompanied by Oliver. They called him the repentant boss, and although some insulted him at first, others began to thank him. Amidst all this change, John discovered something that surprised him more than any number. For the first time in his life, he slept peacefully. One afternoon, sitting in a humble park, he heard Oliver say, "You always had everything, sir, but you never had peace. I lost my business, my family, everything I loved, but I always had peace, and peace, believe me, can't be bought with 1,000 Ferraris." John looked him in the eye. There was no arrogance in those words, only truth, a truth that had haunted him since the first day he humiliated him, and which now revealed itself luminously. "Thank you, Oliver," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved my life." The humble man smiled, with the serenity of someone who had always known that money is not the measure of a human being's worth. That day, John understood what neither his mansions, nor his private planes, nor his gold watches could teach him. True wealth lies not in being feared or adored for what one possesses, but in being loved for what one gives. And finally, after a life of excess and loneliness, John Velarde discovered that his greatest treasure was the dignity he had learned from the man he once tried to humiliate. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed my story. I really appreciate your support and have a great day with your family. See you in the next installment.